Being able to turbo into a 3-cost from no bodies on board in water, or even on your first turn, is not a new concept in water. Players have been known of this and been doing it with Majesty since base set. However, Majesty's not that great. But now that we've got a new water 3-cost in Chronodile, I really want to revisit this concept, specifically with this card and what it does, just to see how much, does it have legs to stand on as a potentially viable deck, or at least a fun deck that's better than Majesty. And I want to share what I have discovered with experimenting with this and what list I have come up with so far. So how I plan on breaking down this deck profile for Turbodile here is 1, going over the man himself, Chronodile, because this is the main focal point of the deck, the main theory behind it, and just kind of dictates all the choices that have been made in this deck list. Then I'll just kind of go over the ratios of and content of this deck list real quick before then just doing a detailed breakdown of why I made each individual card choice. This also will include the Spirit deck. Before I get into the side deck, I'll then go over kind of a Mulligan guide, because the Mulligan is very, very important for this deck. Then I'll break into some of the challenges that this deck will face and how this deck can perform, compensate for that, as well as then that will lead into the discussion for the side deck. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with some other cards to experiment with. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the man himself, Chronodile here. So, new card from Daybreak here. The main appeal for this card for this turbo deck is its second effect. While you have at least 6 enchanting, water, or solar, this Chronodile cannot be targeted by your opponent's card effects. Targeting protection makes it really difficult to deal with. So if you can kind of slap this down the board out of nowhere, yeah, your opponent's going to be scrambling to find an out for it most likely, or just trying to find a way to get past it so they can continue progressing their game state to a victory for themselves. And that can be very warping and very difficult to deal with. And that kind of leads the main guiding principle of this deck. If I can just get Chronodile out, I should be able to find a line to win with it. Big ask, yes, but that's kind of part of the fun of it, seeing if it can do that. Its first effect helps with this, as you can dischant water from this Chronodile in order to target and destroy a card. That means that we can either wall up with it and disrupt the opponent's plays, or we can disrupt the opponent's plays until we can safely just kind of attack with it for game. Or I guess that can go hand in hand. You wall up until you can safely attack with it for game, or if there isn't really a moment where you can safely attack with it, you can just kind of wall up, and as long as you got a higher deck count, you can just stall at your opponent if they don't have an adequate out to it as well. So all the choices in the deck are kind of centered around just getting into this Chronodile ASAP, and then from there, Chronodile should do the heavy lifting to be able to get us to a victory. I also want to quickly go over the turbo concept for those of you who are not familiar with it. That involves Poseidon here, as its ability to Nexus 1 to an Elestral means that as long as we got a body on board and haven't used our normal action, we can get up to 2 spirits and immediately go into the 3-spirit Chronodile. Tadpuff is a great pairing with this as well, as its special casts itself out, meaning we got our 1 cost, we Nexus on from Poseidon onto it, and then we still have our normal action to then go into the Chronodile at a moment's notice. So that is the turbo package. But backing up here, well, let me zoom out so we can view the actual list. For the key cards of this deck, I run 3 Chronodile, 3 Poseidon, 3 Tadpuff, and I'd say tertiary to these cards are 3 Trident of Poseidon. Then for consistency invokes, 3 Drops of Lethe, 3 Nectar of the Gods, and 3 First Light. For Elestrals, for consistency purposes, 3 Plucky, 1 Nebuleo. Divines, I run 3 Hephaustus and 3 Apollo, also for consistency. To help insulate my board and protect against what my opponent can do, I run 3 Gorgon's Gaze and 3 Tsunami. And then finally, this deck can get very expensive, so we run 3 Ambrosia to help it give it a bit more longevity and fuel to be able to help Chronodile push for that win condition. So a lot of 3-ubs, and the reason I feel all right with all these 3-ubs is because, as I mentioned, the Chronodile is doing the heavy lifting, so I really just want to maximize my ways and probability of being able to get into the Chronodile, and from that point on, I don't really care all that much what I draw, because the Chronodile is doing all the work here, not the cards I draw. Moving into the detailed descriptions of these choices, let's start out with the Turbodile portion of the deck. Of course, the Chronodile, I've already kind of discussed this in the core philosophies of this deck, why this is here, so I don't see much reason to revisit it. We'll bring back up this card later in the video when we discuss proper play patterns and how to kind of play around your opponent's potential outs to it. Poseidon here, obviously part of the Turbodile process, is very important here. because even if we just are working off of a Plucky the following turn, like getting that to stick a turn, or a Nebuleo, we can still perform the play without the Tadpuff to be able to Nexus to it and immediately go into the Chronodile. The second reason to run this card is also because it gets us to that 6 spirit count on board with the Chronodile. A Turbodile play leaves us with 3 spirits on Chronodile, 3 spirits left on Poseidon. That's perfect to enable the protection effect, and we can go from there. Tadpuff, of course, lets us get into this a bit sooner, means we also don't have to necessarily stick a body on board, but it also means we can kind of better play around some of our opponent's answers, especially if we can find multiple Tadpuff or just get a body to stick on board. I'll get a bit more into that later in the video here, but those are the key cards and why we're running. It's really the crux of the deck, consistently getting into Chronodile quickly with a protection effect. As for the Trident of Poseidon, the reason we run this card is that Chronodile is very slow. Just being able to pop a card, it can make it very tedious to try to get to a place where we can win. But if we have Trident of Poseidon, we can throw that down, shut down the counter runes, and just start attacking freely anyway. And the reason this is so important is because one of the biggest outs of Chronodile is Shield of Achilles, since it does not target. Therefore, I do not want to attack until I can safely guarantee I will not get shielded. Sometimes it can be pop and back row, which can be very tedious, especially if my opponent starts setting bluffs and whatnot. But Trident just says, don't care about it, just switch it to attack, start attacking, and go. And before I continue on with the rest of this deck list, if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. All signs of support is always greatly appreciated. Next up, we got our Invoke consistency cards with Drops, Nog, and First Light. So Drops and Nog are more just generically good consistency cards, just seeing extra cards, and then a better Mulligan in general, since we can keep the pieces that we want to keep and shuffle back everything else to try to dig for the pieces that we are missing. These two in tandem are also especially good, as Nog gives you more cards to see, both drawing 2 more, and you either get to keep the ones you want, or shuffle them, have extra cards to shuffle back with Drops to then draw even more cards. First Light here is the way we can more consistently find the Chronodile and stack it on top of the deck, set up or draw for next turn, or with stuff like Nectar of the Gods or Apollo, get it to hand right away to more quickly get into it, or at least guarantee that we have it in hand for next turn. This card also can help search out the Nebuleo and the Plucky. However, if we're doing that, we really need to have Nectar of the Gods or Apollo to be able to add those to hand, because we don't want to be waiting until next turn to draw it, to then cast and wait another turn to find Chronodile. That's just taken too much time there. But some extra flexibility and utility with First Light as well. It can also be found off of Nebuleo if we still need to find like a Chronodile or something. So there's a lot of small and bigger applications for this card that make it but gives a good reason to run it overall. Speaking of those Solar Elestrals, Plucky and Nebuleo. So Plucky is a phenomenal card for this deck because it helps us find our divine runes. The Poseidon obviously is the most important, but also then having the flexibility to either go for the Hephaustus or Apollo is great. And on top of that, this card is great to, if we don't have the Tadpuff, to be able to set up for a Chronodile next turn, as if we can get the Plucky to stick on board. It helps us find our Poseidon, meaning this is 2 combo pieces in 1. And that's great. Now, that being said, we do also need a way to potentially protect it. So then we need like a 3rd combo piece, but generally those are like the Tsunami and Gorgon's case, but those are generally just good to have anyway. So I see this still as a net benefit, and maybe not a full card less for the combo, but maybe like half a card less because of that. Nebuleo I liked as my one of, because if I don't need to go into the Plucky or can't find it, the Foretell 4 to push up a card I potentially want or need to the top of the deck is really, really handy. This can be like a Tadpuff, Chronodile, like really it can help me just at least dig 4 cards deeper into the deck to find any combo pieces that I am missing. Or again, just find me a good card in general to have on my next turn. It also then lets me search for the First Lights, meaning that if I'm missing like a Chronodile, that means I have 6 hits here that I can potentially do. Since I find a First Light, just stack the Chronodile, draw it next turn anyway. So I've really liked it. Only the one of, because most of the time I just want to go for the Plucky anyway, but it's a nice backup to have if I end up finding it and don't find the Plucky. For the Divine Runes, of course, we saw the Hephaustus and the Apollo. Apollo's a bit more self-explanatory, I think, because we brought on a bunch of Solar Elestrals, Foretell 3, dig for it, pairs nicely with First Light, and just helps us get 3 cards deeper into the deck, and can also act like how I mentioned with Nebuleo is, if I have most of my combo pieces anyway, it's just an extra top 3, try to dig deeper for a piece as well. Hephaustus, though, this was a more last-minute addition just because I wanted more cards that were live for consistency, and since Trident really helps speed up this deck's game plan, just being able to run an extra few copies of it seemed really, really good. On top of that, this has additional utility in that if I foretold and don't really find anything on the top or have stacked anything that I particularly want, this is a great way to shuffle the deck to be able to have a chance at a random draw, because that, if I don't want the top, I'd rather random draw anyway. That's it for the consistency cards. Of course, the Gorgon's Gaze and Tsunami, these usually are pretty self-explanatory in decks because they're just the best way of dealing with attacks and very universal dealing with attacks and problematic Elestral effects. In this deck though, these cards are also useful because they help protect, say, a Plucky or a Nebuleo that we need to stick on the board for next turn to be able to turbo into the Chronodile. Oh, and these also can help protect the Chronodile itself if the opponent tries to attack over it, or use, if they somehow dismantle or suppress it or dismantle the protection effect and then go for like an Elestral effect like a Kinleo. Gorgon's Gaze also helps prevent that destruction. And then finally, the Ambrosias, we just needed some extra longevity in the deck. This deck is very expensive to get to the Chronodile, and of course we use one Spirit a turn with Chronodile to pop cards, so just being able to have some extra gas is very useful. I originally wasn't running this, but I very much missed it because I was just running out of steam a bit too much. So even though this doesn't help us dig for our pieces to facilitate the Chronodile combo, I still think it's a crucial card for this deck. Moving over to the Spirits, I run 5 Solar Spirits, and this is because this gives us 1 Spirit for Chronodile, 1 Spirit for the Plucky or the Nebuleo. Sometimes this can overlap, but there are definitely times where I want both of them. 1 for First Light, and then 2 for Apollo. And 2 for Apollo can be very relevant, as if we just have a Plucky on board, if our opponent Earthquakes it, we want a way to try to dig for another buy to set up for the following turn. So I found 5 to be the number that I really want. Every time I've wanted more than 5, most of the time I'm not winning anyway, thus I don't see a reason to run these as more, because then I'm just using it for the generic runes anyway, and water is just the better spirit to have if I need excess anyway. Also run the 1 Vipyro for the Hephaustus, don't need any more, just use the Hephaustus once, grab the Trident, good to go. It's really a tertiary thing, so it's not like I'm using Hephaustus right away anyway. If I'm using it, it's to either shuffle the deck or find the Trident, in which case I don't need a second one. I leave space for 14 Leviaphin here, the main spirit. The reason this is the best is because it's the one we want to use the most for stuff like Poseidon, but also re-enchant Chronodile to fuel its protection effect and its pop effect on top of that. Now, that being said, this is also the spirit because we have the most abundance. We're expending for Mulligan, we're using for Nectar of the Gods, Drops of Lethe, or the Gorgon's Gaze. Now, if we have extra solar, I phrase it this way. Solar can also work in a very similar fashion. Therefore, it's fine having excess solar. That's why we use the water and why I'm not too worried. Like, I just want the bare minimum for the max I want to see, because if I have excess, what I can literally do is, as long as I have 2 water on Chronodile, I can re-enchant solar and my protection effect's still good to go. Most of the time I'll have more than the 2 water. I can even have like 3 because we're nexusing onto the Poseidon. Most of the time we're re-enchanting with water anyway. So as long as we have excess water, we can re-enchant solar, make sure it still has a protection effect up, and then expend 1 of the water or existing on to pop a card. So I found this spirit deck to be the most optimal that I have built, so I don't foresee many changes as long as this list remains relatively intact. I feel really good about the spirit deck. Now I kind of alluded to this when going over the spirit deck, but ways that we make sure this Chronodile can stick on board isn't just leaving Poseidon up on board. That actually gives the opponent a way to get rid of the protection effect if they can remove the Poseidon. So one main goal of this deck is to typically try to get 6 spirits onto the Chronodile to eliminate that possibility from the opponent. Now, if they want to deal with the Chronodile, they either need to attack over it or find a way to suppress it with something like Dense Fog and then remove it with something like Earthquake. Other ways we can help insulate this Chronodile is if we have multiple Poseidon on board. We can usually set up 2 Poseidon with the same number of spirits, and now even if the opponent has a rune destruction effect, it still will keep the protection effect up. On top of that, it also lets us accelerate to the 6 spirits on Chronodile a bit faster, also give us more flexibility in being able to use its disenchant effect to pop cards. Like when you do the Chronodile Turbodile play, it typically leaves Chronodile with exactly 3 spirits, so we're not getting the pop effect the first turn it hits, but an extra Poseidon can get us there. And it also can work similarly to once we get up to the 6 spirits, where sometimes you might have to pass on a turn just to keep it at the 6 spirits, but with an extra Poseidon, sometimes you can get to the 7th spirit and then use its effect that way. Technically speaking, other cards help facilitate that as well. Just having another body on board can, misenchanting Hephaestus can, having an Apollo on board can, though usually like on the first turn, you don't want to, you can 3-enchant Apollo to match up Poseidon, but then if your opponent gets rid of Poseidon, Apollo really isn't that great. It's not the most ideal. Typically when I like Apollo or a misenchanted Hephaustus is another Elestral on board is when I have a Trident out, because at that point, as long as I've got one Poseidon, any one of these 3 cards, now my opponent has to pop minimum 2 of these cards to remove the protection effect, and that's just super obnoxious. So that is the main way to protect the Chronodile and is super important and the most proactive way with the resources we already have to run in this deck to be able to get to this game plan, to be able to play around some of the most common answers the opponent has to the Chronodile. Look at this goober. He comes in demanding my attention, getting away from the Chronodile. Yeah, you. He also says subscribe. I'm reading between the lines, but I promise he's saying that. Next up, let's discuss Mulligan, because the Mulligan is super important in this deck since we're trying to consistently get into the Chronodile. A lot of times you are actually mulliganing to make sure you can increase your odds for it. The 2 spirits is totally worth it. So it can be tempting to keep hands where you have even 2 of your combo pieces. The combo pieces you need are definitely Chronodile, definitely Poseidon, and then a body on board. So it's really tempting to sometimes keep a Chronodile and Poseidon, but if you don't have a Tadpuff or just a body, it's not worth it. So really what you're checking in your opening hand is, what cards do I have to be able to dig for the pieces that I am missing or just pieces in general? So generally speaking, good hands that you want to keep, 100% is if you have Drops of Lethe. It is just a better mulligan, so there's no reason not to keep it. Nectar of the Gods is also a good one, though from here on out you do have to be careful in checking the odds of finding the piece you need with the cards you have in hand. So it's less so about the individual cards themselves and more the combination you have there. Similar case with First Light, Plucky of course counts as Poseidon as well, but of course if you have Poseidon, this card's also phenomenal because then it can find you the Apollo instead. And other key cards, Apollo is sometimes a nice one to keep, usually in tandem with something else because it lets you dig 3 cards deeper. But really, it's just making sure you're checking those combinations so you have good odds of finding the pieces that you're missing or just digging for pieces in general. So really keep that in mind. It's really hard to kind of give you a definitive step-by-step. You just kind of have to experiment with different scenarios, different opening hands to determine what is optimal and build that understanding and that foundation from there. Moving over to the side deck, this is untested. This is just theories I have based on the matchups that I have struggled with that I potentially want to side in. So the first one is kind of twofold. One is against decks that are trying to attack over the Chronodile, which is mainly Earth, but also against the water matchup where we do have some more aggressive cards such as Eddy. Galaxy, of course, is somewhat aggressive, mainly just that they attack. And those cards can be problematic if we're trying to get like a Plucky to stick on board. So we need alternates for the Tsunami and maybe some extra ones in the case to help insulate the Chronodile. So the ones I've chosen are Altar of Stars to try out and/or Shield of Achilles. So the and/or kind of comes in mainly with the water matchup when you need to remove the Tsunami. Otherwise, I don't foresee you siding in both of these because we just don't really have the space for what we want to sift out here. Altar Stars has the benefit of also accelerating spirits onto our Chronodile to get us to the 6 spirits a bit more consistently. Specifically, I like that in the Earth matchup since they have equal links to be able to pop the Poseidons. Though, obviously, Shield is a bit better to protect the Plucky and whatnot because you don't really want to set up a Divine Rune necessarily early on to get equal links anyway. Cards to switch out if you need to, other than the Tsunamis, are probably the Hephaustus, Nebuleo, and then maybe like a Ambrosia, as I see those as the least important pieces here, as they're more like one-time uses. Ambrosia you can argue keeping up there, but definitely like the Hephaestus I say is number 1. Number 2 is Nebuleo, since that's more of a alternative if we don't need the Plucky, so it doesn't come up as often, and I think you can get rid of one Ambrosia as well. Now, this doesn't always protect against everything, specifically if your opponent has, say, Burn, that's another scary one, or they're using Thunderstorm to get rid of the Poseidons. Divine Blessing is great, or Tornado, that's the other option. Divine Blessing is great to interrupt that. Just being able to make sure that your opponent doesn't get that effect off to protect your end board, and now they need to be able to find another piece. Obviously, oh wait, this invokes, yeah. I was thinking of P-Gus there, which we'll get to in a bit. But yeah, for those invoke stuff, this one's really nice. Just stop it, and you don't have to worry about it again. You might have to worry about follow-up copies. But also, since we have so many spirits on board, likely if we're expecting the opponent to have those answers, we do want to keep extra spirits on board to be able to utilize the Divine Blessing because we don't want to go under the spirit count. Now, Wind was the other one I was mentioning there, and that's where these next two come in play. That is Pandora's Box and Circle of the Sky, though Circle of the Sky is also great for the Earth matchup. The main theory here is, against wind, we want to kind of keep them off the key pieces such as Pigas or the burn pieces such as Exaltair and Toxic Swarm. So being able to shut off the Aeolus effect is really strong. It does cause us to take 2 damage, which isn't ideal, but it's better than them getting to those pieces because then we possibly have to spend resources to out those pieces to make sure they can repeat proc their effect. It's just better to cut them off before they can even hit the board, and then Chronodile can focus on the back row a bit more. Circle the Sky is the other one I like because this one lets us accelerate spirits onto the Chronodile to be able to get it up to the 6 spirits so we don't have to worry about the rune pops anyway. So again, this spirit deck is highly experimental. This is all theory, not actually tested stuff, so definitely take this with a grain of salt and test these out yourself. Finally, moving on to some cards that I have tested or am thinking about testing. The first one I have here is the Pelipperus, which I did test in place of the Nebuleo. This one helps us find our Tadpuff to make it a bit more consistent, so if we don't need the normal cast, we can go Pelipperus, search out the Tadpuff. The problem I found with this and why I isn't currently in my deck and Nebuleo is it's very one note specifically for the Tadpuff. And I don't always need the Tadpuff in the scenario where I'd cast out the Pelipperus. Instead, I really like the Foretell 4 from the Nebuleo to be able to dig for other missing pieces such as Chronodile. I can still find Tadpuff, it's in the top 4. Poseidon, or just other pieces to help insulate the end board. That I just found way more flexible and way more valuable. And on top of that, the Nebuleo inherently plays a bit better around opponent's potential answers such as Gorgon's Gaze, because now the Nebuleo is a valid target to be able to ascend off of while Pelipperus isn't. So in the case that we already have the Tadpuff in hand, now I've got 2 targets that my opponent can't Gorgon's Gaze both. Meanwhile with the Pelipperus, they can just kind of ignore it because it isn't bridging up into the Chronodile anyway. The next card which I kind of thought of was Exaltus, since it can help with its Nexus effect search out the Chronodile, which is the main application to be used for. The reason I didn't include it is because the Nexus doesn't inherently help set up the Chronodile, like it helps find it, but the 2 Solar Spirits, it does help the protection effect a bit, but then I also need a Nexus Bank. So that was the main reason, is it's a 2-card combo with Apollo specifically. We can misenchant Hephaustus. So back when I first built this deck, I really wasn't leaning more into Apollo, hence why I didn't run the Exaltus. So I bring it up here because it is leaning a bit more into excess divine copies where maybe this can be of use to find a Chronodile. So I could see that, but again, it is focusing solely on the Chronodile here, while the Nebuleo is a bit more, it can help find additional pieces, not just the one, just at the cost of it's just depending on what your top 4 is instead of being able to pinpoint search it. So yeah, I would say try this out if this interests you. And finally, I wanted to say it might be right to actually bump up our Nebuleo copies. Maybe cut down onto Hephaustus, use that as the one for the 4 Nebuleo here, because sometimes this deck just can't find a body, and that is a problem. We need a body on board, and Nebuleo at least is something. So the reason I was only running the 1 Nebuleo was because I've been at a point where I was like, I have all these Nebuleo, I've got all these Plucky, I only need one of them. Let me run another card that doesn't require the normal cast. But I can see an argument it might be a bit more optimal, so something definitely worth testing. The other nice thing about the Nebuleo for some fringe applications is when foretelling 4, we can also dig through our deck a bit quicker by adding extra Nebuleo to hand. This can also be great if then we find find a Drops of Lethe to have more copies to shuffle back. Just some more niche applications why I could think running multiple copies would be correct. And that is about it for this Chronodile deck list. It's something I've had a lot of fun testing. I've taken to 2 tournaments now. Haven't done the best with it, but it's been great learning experiences and being able to improve my plays because this is a highly technical deck. And as I mentioned earlier, I really want to share this deck list because I feel like I have it most of the way there, but I still feel like there's a lot of things that can be ironed out, maybe some more ideas to help make it a bit more consistent that I have not explored. So please sound off in the comments with what your thoughts are of this deck, what we can change up in it to make it a bit better, or what's been working for you all. I really am looking forward to the interaction on this video. One thing this video also hasn't addressed is how good is this strategy? Haven't really touched on that, and that is because after this video, within a day or 2, I plan on uploading a discussion video kind of going over some of the statistics with this deck, just to get that answer, actually. So it's going to be a bit of a different video, but I think still an interesting one, so definitely stay tuned for that. And if you've enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload more content. But with all of that being said though, look forward to more content, including Helga's Turbodile deck video coming out real soon.